When I was a kid, I was too intimidated to try and beat a Final Fantasy game. Most of the endgame bosses were way too intense for me, and I didn't have the confidence in myself to defeat them. So instead, I would watch my brother beat most of the 90s Final Fantasy games. He was just better at them than me, and I didn't have to worry about losing if he was playing. But one day when I turned about 12, I thought to myself I wanted to beat a Final Fantasy game. I wanted to see those glorious Final Fantasy endgame cutscenes. I wanted to begin with Final Fantasy I and make my way up to Final Fantasy VII. I needed to start where it all began. This is the story of how I beat my very first Final Fantasy game. Final Fantasy was the very first RPG I had played. Most of the games I had played previously were action platformers. Think of like Blaster Master and Super Mario Bros. Final Fantasy was a totally different kind of game, an RPG. This game had a giant world map, tons of monsters to defeat, and massive bosses. You start off creating a party of 4 with 6 character classes to choose from. I usually went with Fighter, Monk, White Mage, and Black Mage. The Fighter was strong against physical attacks, the Monk was great for physical damage, White Mage was great for healing, and Black Mage did impressive elemental damage. This was my main crew throughout my childhood, and I still like to play these 4 character classes to this day. The first mini-boss you encountered was Garland at the Chaos Shrine to the north. He wasn't too difficult to defeat. A few spells and sword attacks will usually finish him off. You save the princess and the king rewards you with building a bridge to the next objective. At this point you realize that you are the Light Warriors tasked with defeating the 4 fiends and collecting their elemental orbs. The first fiend was the Lich, located close to the town of Melmond. The Lich was causing the earth to rot, and you had to venture to the Earth Cave to defeat him. The Earth Cave was quite difficult as there were many monsters that could stun you or turn your characters to stone, causing a quick game over. But when you did manage to make it to the Lich, he was epic. A massive monster that took up most of the screen. His spells and attacks were quite vicious. I would usually use Fire 3 on him and attack with the Fighter and Monk for physical damage. If you managed to defeat him, you were rewarded with the first elemental orb. Then it was off to see Carrie, a fire fiend who was located at this volcano. This treacherous area was quite relentless as there were many areas covered in lava, and sometimes you had to just walk over it. You collect a bunch of chests, grab the ice sword, and then make your way to the final area. Carrie, the fire fiend, would also take up half the screen. My tactics were to use ice spells and a fire to mitigate some of her spells. After obtaining the second orb, I would usually retrieve the airship so that I could upgrade my classes. Bahamut the Dragon would do just that once you had completed the test of courage. At this stage in the game, you were able to head over to the Sunken Shrine to defeat the third fiend. In order to go to the Sunken Shrine though, you would need the Ox Sail from a fairy to allow you to breathe underwater. At the bottom of the shrine you'd find Kraken. He had some pretty hard physical attacks, but again, as long as you were leveled decently, he shouldn't have been too much of a problem. I say that even though one of my guys is down. Now in order to fight the fourth fiend, you had to travel to the Flying Fortress. You make your way through this cool futuristic area and fight some crazy strong enemies. At the very end of the fortress is Tiamat. I found Tiamat to be one of the easier fiends to defeat. He will have the Wind Orb, and once you collected it, you could head over to the Chaos Shrine. This is where you'd find out that the source of the world's corruption had been taking place 2,000 years in the past by Chaos. This part of the game was quite difficult because you'd have limited healing items and only so many spells to cast. You cannot save your game midway through the shrine, and you had to defeat super versions of all 4 fiends. Finally, when you reached the end, you would run into Chaos and have the ending battle. Now you can see why this fight is so intimidating. If you die, you are sent all the way back to the beginning of the Chaos Shrine. I remember walking into this fight and the first attack Chaos used on me killed my Black Mage. I was left with my White Mage, Knight, and Black Belt. I had no choice but to push on and just keep attacking with everything I had. Midway through the battle, my mom called me to come downstairs. It was time for family lunch. I had to leave the game as it was until lunch was over. I remember just sitting there at the lunch table thinking about how I was going to survive Chaos without my Black Mage. My parents were looking at me strangely asking, "Is everything okay, Adam?" My heart was pounding. I thought I was going to die in game. I just responded, "Yep, everything's fine." I just wanted to get back to the game as soon as possible. After lunch was finished, I raced back upstairs to my game and kept attacking, hoping my fighter's Excalibur sword and my monk's massive physical damage would be enough. Thankfully it was. I just barely managed to scrape by with what I had. My White Mage had even used up all her healing magic. Chaos slowly started to fade away, the screen was shaking and I couldn't believe it. To go back to the very first Final Fantasy and beat it on my own, it was just too surreal. Which then gave me the courage to move on to Final Fantasy II on the Super Nintendo. You see, up until this point, whenever I played a Final Fantasy game, I would stop near the end because I was too afraid to try and face the last bosses. But thanks to defeating Chaos, I had the courage to fight them. Zeromus was next on my list, and sure enough, I was able to defeat him too. Then it was on to Kefka for Final Fantasy III. I defeated him using the gem box and casting multiple ultimas on him. That was 3 down. The latest Final Fantasy at the time was Final Fantasy VII. I remember vividly my brother showing me the end of the game, him beating Sephiroth. How was I supposed to beat Sephiroth? His supernova attack looked insane. There was no way, but I had to try and do it myself. I needed the closure. Thanks to the ribbons I had acquired throughout the game, they helped me not get affected by Supernova's status effects, and I was able to use Omni Slash on him. That was it. I beat all the mainline North American releases up to that point. I felt like a true Final Fantasy fan. But, just as I was celebrating, another Final Fantasy was around the corner. It was Final Fantasy VIII. This was the first Final Fantasy I was able to beat before my brother. I will never forget just barely beating the final boss in this one. I was down to just Squall, and he only had 1 spell left. He casted Comet, and that was the final push that was needed to win. It was all thanks to beating the first Final Fantasy that I was able to muster up the courage to complete the others, an experience I will never forget. Still to this day, I will pop in Final Fantasy I on the NES just to relive those moments. I'm sure we all have stories like that. If you had something like this happen to you, leave a comment and share your story. Thanks for listening, and we will see you guys in the next video.